My name is Vanaj Vidyan. I have secured rank 278 in Civil Services Examination 2025. This was my third attempt at the Civil Services, like other subjects, let's say sociology or anthropology. But at the same time, you should remember that there are only three things that you need if you want to write with law optional and score well. These days we've had toppers in the 270s and 280s, and the average score has hovered somewhere in the 250s and 260s. So that's why you need to be much more well prepared for paper 2. It's not possible to write without knowledge in paper 2 as much as it is possible in paper 1. क्योंकि जब आप directly constitution से पढ़ते हो, your understanding of polity is a lot more different than somebody who is reading just, let's say, M. Lakshmikant sir ki book. Secondly, yes, the syllabus is very vast. It takes quite a bit of time to cover. But once you cover it, you are not under the constant stress of reading the newspapers every day to just get current affairs for law. Hi everyone, welcome to this strategy session on law optional. My name is Vanaj Vidyan. I have secured rank 278 in Civil Services Examination 2025. This was my third attempt at the Civil Services. I have had law optional throughout and I got selected with the law optional. So I felt that this is the strategy session which is much needed. A little bit about my background. I studied from National Law University, Lucknow, 18 to 23. So 23 is when I graduated and I was the gold medalist there. Subsequent to which I enrolled in my Masters of Law, where I was also awarded the gold medal. I have attempted the first mains examination right in 2023. So I wrote it along with just graduating from college. The reason I'm telling you all of this is to show that one, preparing for law optional is possible along with your university, whether you're not in law school, that's one. And secondly, and quite a bit more importantly, I was enrolled in my master's while I've cleared this exam as well. So in both the ways, you should be absolutely clear that studying law is a huge boost when you are writing this exam, because you're consistently in the paper writing mode and you're surrounded by the world of law, even when you're not writing the mains. So that is one. You have the law syllabus behind me, but I want to take you all through a few steps as we move through this session. So let's go to how this session I'm going to conduct it. So firstly, we'll go through the syllabus. What I mean by the syllabus is that we'll go through the syllabus in detail a little bit later. But firstly, I want you to understand that if you're just at a beginning stage and if you plan to write with law optional, the very first thing that you should do is go to the syllabus and skim the entire syllabus. Read every part of it. It's like 4 to 5 pages long for law. And you'll realize that it's not an easy syllabus to complete. You will also realize that almost the entirety of the things that you've studied across 5 years of law school, just take out the procedural parts of it, you take out CRPC, you take out CPC, and the rest of the legal subjects are here. So you have constitutional law, you have international law, you have quite a bit of mercantile law, sometimes even beyond what we study in law school. So it's a very vast syllabus, that's one. At the same time, the good part about this is that you will find out that almost every part of the syllabus is something you would have at least heard of, if not particularly studied. So the good parts about law optional are that usually the things you would hear are not some things that are completely out of the blue. You would have been aware of it in some way or another when you were in law school. You might even have studied these subjects in quite a bit of depth in law school, if you were in law school, by the way. So that's where law school helps you. That's where reading the syllabus should be the first thing you do. The second part, which is mentioned here, is what you need if you decide that, okay, law optional is what you want to write. See, I'm a very big advocate of education being accessible, and law, it's true that there's not quite a bit of high amount of guidance available in law optional, like other subjects, let's say sociology or anthropology. But at the same time, you should remember that there are only three things that you need if you want to write with law optional and score well. One is that you need a Baer Act for all the subjects that matter here. Secondly, in addition to the Baer Act, you need a book or a collection of previous year questions. Now, these previous year questions could be going anywhere back to even 2000, but ideally the last 12 to 13 years, in fact, after 2013 is when the UPSC syllabus changed. So at least the PYQs from 2013 up until 2025 if you're writing 2026. So these are the two things that you need. And the third thing that you would necessarily need is an internet connection. All the material that you'll ever need for law optional is already there on the internet. So it's, yes, guidance per se is not available, but material is easily available on a lot of free websites, etc. And if you've studied, then even your university notes would come and help you out quite a bit. So that is one. These are the three things you need. Third, should you take law? Now, I've been getting this question even before I was selected by my juniors or by people who want to take law optional. So One thing is whether you're a law graduate or you're not a law graduate. See, if you're not a law graduate, there are tons of examples where people clear with law optional. I think even this year, somebody in rank 740s is somebody who has cleared despite being from an engineering background and taking law optional. So is it possible? Yes. Has it been done? Yes. Should you do it? Depends. Law is a predictable subject. The paper that you will see has a high amount of repetition. But at the same time, there are a few cons. It's not as high scoring as other subjects. By what this means is that in the last few years, we have not seen somebody scoring 300. I mean, there must be people, but I have not heard of them. So 300 is not a score that you can for sure achieve. It could happen, just doesn't happen as often. These days, we've had toppers in the 270s and 280s, and the average score has hovered somewhere in the 250s and 260s. So it's lower than other optionals, that's one. It's not as high as other optionals, that's also two. But it also comes with the benefit that one, the syllabus is predictable, even if it's huge, which means that once you complete the syllabus, uske baad you don't need to take a lot of stress and it's just all revision. It's not as dynamic as something like PSIR is, although PNS replacing IPC changes my statements quite a bit. But even then, that's one. And secondly, and more importantly, the good thing about it is that if it is your graduation subject, and this is what I decided on when I was confused between law and a few other subjects during my first attempt, I figured that if a question comes of which I know nothing about, and let's say I have an option like anthropology or psychology, versus I have something like law, law would be one subject where I would be able to write at least something, even when I know nothing about it, because I would have heard of it in 5 years of law school and the subsequent years that I've prepared. I could not have said the same about any other subject that was not my graduation subject. So this was something that tilted the balance in my favor. But take it with a pinch of salt based on your circumstances, based on how much seriously you studied law. I studied it quite seriously during my law school, but how much seriously did you study it? How much do you already know it, or would it be like that you're starting from scratch? And thirdly, that know that the upside scoring potential in law remains relatively lower than the other subjects. But of course, it's often said that people in law optional end up scoring higher in interviews. So if you have that confidence in yourself, you can go for it. I cleared it with law, so can you. And so many people within the top 100 this year have cleared it with law as well. So no love laws there. The next part that you should is answering the question. I'll also come to it in a little bit of detail. But what this essentially means is that because it's a static paper, which means it's not a very dynamic paper, therefore the art of answering the question becomes really important. And I'll show you what I mean is by breaking the question, and I'll take you through a bit of the question papers as well. But that's also something that I'll be taking you through this session. And lastly, the role of current affairs in law optional. Again, I cannot understate it or overstate it at the same time. You might not see a direct question on current affairs in law optional. Even if you do, it's hardly 2 questions, 1 paper, 4 questions in 2 papers, not even 4 questions, 2 papers. But at the same time, to score well, you should be able to integrate current affairs in your answers, even if the question is not current based. So I'll talk you through my strategy of what I did, and of course you can supplement it with whatever you find is best. And in addition, there's one more thing that I wanted to discuss, which is there on the other slide. It's basically the difference in approach that you may need to have when you're approaching it as paper 1 versus paper 2. So what are certain things that are different in your approach? Which of them have higher scoring potentials if such a thing exists, etc. So this is essentially what I plan to do with this session. So firstly, let's take up the syllabus, right? Let's go to the syllabus and view it in detail. So this is the law syllabus. You can see I've taken it right from the UPSC website itself. It's not really long. So this is 1 page, 2 page, 3 page, 4 pages. That's it. So it's a 4-page syllabus, and it covers both paper 2 and paper 1. Paper 1, for those of you who have already written, would know it's constitutional law, international law, and administrative law. Paper 2 is mercantile law, criminal law, and contemporary legal developments and the law of torts. So quite extensive, as I said, things that we study across 5 years minus the procedure. If you look at constitutional law, see, I don't want to take too much time on constitutional law because I'm sure that most of you would be well aware of it. Even if nothing, aapne Lakshmikant padhi hogi, which is 50-70% constitutional law itself. 2 or 3 things that are really important for constitutional law. The first thing is that whatever you do, you must remember the articles of the constitution. That's a sine qua non, and I won't say this, ye itna important hai baki subjects mein, but in constitutional law, you should know the articles because at the end of the day, it's the grand norm of India, it's the holy grail of our books. So that's one. Secondly, case laws. A lot of you would have doubts कि case laws कितने important है law optional में. See, case laws are important, of course, उसमें कोई दो राय नहीं है. But if there's one subject jahan case law sabse important hai, then that is constitutional law. So everybody, like people who don't even have law, would know about cases like Keshwanand Bharti and things like Menka Gandhi, I.R. Kohelu, and all of these things. If you have law optional, you are expected to know more and expected to be able to present more. So that's really, really important. Case laws in this subject are very important. Thirdly, I would say कि the one subject जहाँ पे current affairs का अच्छा खासा scope है is also constitutional law, because consistently Supreme Court of India is really active, so we keep getting judgments. Based on those judgments, you might get a question. So, for example, if I'm not wrong, this year or last year, I think this year only, we had a question on the governor judgment between the presidential reference and the two judges' opinion. So that we have every year at least one question comes. Abhi, I'll take you through the question paper. There was also a question on L. Chandra Kumar on the administrative law side. So it's consistently dynamic. Things that are in news will definitely find a place in constitutional law. And another good part is that you'll always have space to integrate current affairs within your constitutional law answers. So, for example, let's say there's a question on tribunals, and the last year there was a question on L. Chandra Kumar. Then in the end, you can mention the recent judgment of the Supreme Court, जहाँ पर administrative tribunals के बारे में Supreme Court has made an observation that they're very important or that they're not important. You can just make it a part of your conclusion and mention the year there. So that's one way you can include constitutional law and current affairs. This is one of the best subjects for that. The second thing, and if you look at the syllabus, the material for this is very easily available online. बहुत time आपको लगेगा कि पॉलिटी के मटेरियल से ही हो जाएगा, which is almost true if you include current affairs and case laws within it. There's also some things that we don't really study much in law school. So, for example, local bodies and eminent domain. These were things that we did not cover very well in law school. So, some dedicated preparation is obviously necessary. The good part or the bad part about the law optional syllabus is that it's exhaustive, which means that because it mentions everything, that's one. But secondly, there's almost no part of this paper जो UPSC पूछता नहीं है. So every headline that is mentioned becomes important and you have to prepare all of them. क्योंकि almost हर part से UPSC questions पूछती रही है. So that makes reading the syllabus and understanding it really important. With respect to some parts that we study in law school, some parts that we don't, make sure that you do. So here is where administrative law starts. So 12, 13, 14, 15 and 16 are administrative law, जहाँ पर आप Westbury principles and all of these things you study. This is also an easier part to do, but make sure you do it. In my first attempt, I could not find enough time to study administrative law and that costed me in the paper. Because I thought ये तो जल्दी जल्दी हो जाएगा, but इतना जल्दी भी नहीं हो पाता जितना आप सोचते हो. So that is one. With respect to international law, so international law is a very interesting subject. One, because this is, especially in things like law of the seas, this is one of the only papers where you have a scope to make diagrams within law. Otherwise, they don't obviously make diagrams in law. Secondly, what's important in this paper is conventions and articles. Obviously, conventions are important. It's like the constitution in that sense. अगर आपको convention पता है तो it's really good. अगर आपको पता है Montevideo Convention किस चीज़ के लिए है और एविएशन लॉज के लिए कौन सी कन्वेंशंस हैं, शिकागो कन्वेंशन है, एटसेट्रा एटसेट्रा, दैट्स वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. दैट इंक्रीजेज योर मार्क्स बाय क्वाइट अ बिट. Secondly, case laws. Now, international law also has quite a bit of case laws, but they're very few in number and they're very landmark in that sense because ICJ is not as active as the Supreme Court. Therefore, the number of cases that you have are really less. And if you remember those cases, your answers become elevated quite a bit because in my opinion, not a lot of people are able to prepare international law के case laws क्योंकि इनको हम कॉलेज में भी इतना पढ़ते नहीं है. Constitutional law we keep studying and integrating everywhere. It's not the same with international law. So that's one. In addition, one thing that you can do, and especially with regard to things that are in the beginning, right? Nature and definition of international law, relationship between international and municipal law. The role of theorists here is very important. So theorists like Oppenheimer or all of these people that you keep studying about, you can mention them and that also is a very good value addition. So that would be there in your source. Another good thing about paper one, and that remains true for international law, is that material is very easily available online. अगर आप सिर्फ ये कीवर्ड डाल दोगे ना, state recognition and state succession law, तो free websites would have enough good content that you don't even need to search for particular content because the content for paper one is quite easily available. Thirdly, this is also a subject where you have some scope for current affairs. You can mention, for example, I remember that in one question on the nature of individual in international law and how it is evolving, I remember mentioning about Elon Musk and Starlink and about how Starlink is now a subject of international law because of what happened in Ukraine. And that's how, from a moment where only and only nations were a part of international law, today companies are becoming a part of international law, and not only international law, but international affairs in general. So this is how I integrated current affairs at one point, and that's also something you can do. In some ways also, so you remember the part of contemporary legal developments. The last part of the international law syllabus, so legality of use of nuclear weapons, international terrorism, new international economic order, human environment, international efforts. So this remains something which is almost like CLD because it depends upon the news that exists in the current world. जैसे अभी ईरान में वॉर चल रहा है, so you have consistent news coming about JCPOA and consistent news coming about the denuclearization, the NPT, etc. So if a question comes on this, which is the nuclearization or denuclearization treaties, you must mention Iran in your answers. So that's how you integrate current affairs with your international law preparation. Especially with respect to the last things, ऊपर में तो इतना scope नहीं है. You can't really talk about international like current affairs and things like high seas, etc. But otherwise you can. So that's almost it from my end on paper one. One thing that you should remember with terms of administrative law is that it's very short, so it's great to cover as long as you're able to cover it. It doesn't take a lot of time to cover it. So that is one. And it has like tribunals ka part, it has administrative review ka part, separation of powers ka part. So make sure that you cover it well. And once you cover it, it's not very dynamic except for a few case laws that come a year. So let's move to paper 2 now, right? Paper 2, there are some characteristics of paper 2. And here is where I'll also cover the difference between paper 1 and paper 2. So let's go there first. See, the difference between paper 2 and paper 1 and the approach there is in paper 1, your articles and conventions are really important because without them, there's no law that really you can write. But paper 2 is a lot more conceptual. So for example, if you look at things like sale of goods, there's a chance that because there are so many sections, you might not remember it. But the question might simply be on conditions and warranties. So even if you don't remember the section, even if you don't remember the case law, if you do remember what the section said, what are the various conditions and warranties for a seller and a buyer, you might still be able to write something which will fetch you marks. If the question is on state in paper 1 and आपने article 12 नहीं लिखा, so it's going to lead to a very bad impression. But that's not going to be likely not going to be the case in paper 2. Of course, if you can write the section, nothing better. I'm saying even if you don't, it's not as harmful. And with case laws, this threshold even decreases quite a bit. Because for case laws, it's even more okay if you skip case laws. Other than law of torts, अगर आपको contracts में या sale of goods में case laws नहीं याद है, it's okay. It's not a very big detriment. I remember this time I was searching for case laws on Sale of Goods Act for my preparation, और मुझे case laws मिल ही नहीं रहे थे अच्छे. That means it's not there. If you were not able to find it, you don't have to like dig inside a tunnel to fetch out a case law for a question that might or might not come. So in that respect, and especially with regard to the remote sections, it's not that important as it is in paper 1. So that's one with regard to section and case laws. Second, with respect to current affairs, I discussed the scope of current affairs in paper 1, and that's obviously quite a bit. In paper 2, that reduces. For example, if there's a question asking for the difference between murder and culpable homicide, what current affairs can you integrate there, right? Like almost nothing. So current affairs are not as important for paper 2, which is why some other things become, and I'm not talking about CLD. CLD is of course current, but other than that. Third, and this is where the balancing part of UPSC comes in. See, current affairs are not as important in paper 2, but that's also because paper 2 is a lot more technical than paper 1. Paper 1 में, even if you don't know something about the constitution, you can, think about what it might be. अगर governor or president के बारे में नई judgment आपको नहीं भी पता, तो भी you would know that, okay, there's a tension between executive and the legislature or executive and the judiciary and what that tension might be, and you might be able to write something which will fetch you at least some marks. Here, and I'll give you an example from my first mains in 2023. I specifically remember this question. It was probably the first question of the section B of paper 2, section A of paper 2. And that question was, what do you understand by transferred malice? Now, I had at that point never heard of this term, despite 5 years of law school. I did not know transferred malice kya hota hai, and I don't even know what I wrote in that paper. So, that scope would not have been there in paper 1. वहाँ पे आपको कुछ ना कुछ पता होता है. But in paper 2, if you don't know transferred malice, you essentially lose all 10 of those marks. So that's why you need to be much more well prepared for paper 2. What that essentially means is that it's not possible to, like if you see here, it's not possible to write without knowledge in paper 2 as much as it is possible in paper 1, except for the contemporary legal development parts, which we'll cover. Fourth is theorists. There are almost no theorists that you'll have to remember for paper 2. I can't recall. थोड़े बहुत क्रिमिनल लॉ में है, थोड़े बहुत टॉर्ट्स के बिल्कुल बिगिनिंग में डेफिनेशन है, सैलमन एंड विनफील्ड एटसेट्रा, बट बियॉन्ड दैट यू डोंट रियली हैव एज मेनी थियोरिस्ट्स एज यू हैव इन इंटरनेशनल लॉ. And lastly, with respect to the remote subjects, so international, I mean, paper one doesn't really have that many remote subjects. There can be remote topics, but there are several acts within paper two that are sort of remote. What that means is ki Prevention of Corruption Act or Protection of Civil Rights Act. These are things we don't study in law school at all. And then UPSC could sometimes ask a 15-marker question or 20-marker question only on the Protection of Civil Rights Act. So if you don't know that, you lose out on quite a bit. And trust me, law is such a vast subject to prepare that if you don't plan this out well, there's a very good chance कि आप उसे लास्ट तक प्रिपेयर नहीं कर पाओगे. मेरे साथ इतनी बार हुआ है कि इंडियन पार्टनरशिप एक्ट और दी LLP एक्ट मैं लास्ट तक प्रिपेयर नहीं कर पाता था और लास्ट में मैं सिर्फ कॉक्स वर्सेस किंग्स पढ़ के जा रहा हूँ फॉर पार्टनरशिप, विच इज़ नॉट अ गुड स्ट्रैटेजी एट ऑल. सो दैट्स व्हाई आई एम सेइंग कि बी वेरी केयरफुल विद दिस. UPSC would and does ask from any part of the syllabus. The good thing is whatever is the syllabus, almost that is the question, other than the analytical parts that I'll discuss in थोड़ा सा देर. But अगर आपने syllabus में वो है तो वो question हो सकता है. You should know something about it. That's why you should be focusing on the syllabus and the corresponding questions. I said in the beginning that you'll need a PYQ booklet. Take a PYQ booklet for law optional at least from 2000, but sometimes even 2012 or 2013 is when you'll need it. And take one which has divided the questions based on the syllabus topic. तो अगर syllabus topic लिखा हुआ है ऑफेंसेस अगेंस्ट द ह्यूमन बॉडी, तो सारे ऑफेंसेस अगेंस्ट द ह्यूमन बॉडी के क्वेश्चंस हो, सो दैट वंस यू आर एबल टू, द स्ट्रैटेजी दैट आई फॉलोड वाज दैट आई वुड हैव देम इन माय नोट्स दैट आई वुड प्रिपेयर, और एक बार वो नोट्स हो जाएंगे उसके बाद मैं PYQs उठाता था एंड आई वुड मेक श्योर कि मेरे नोट्स से क्या वो PYQs आंसर हो पा रहे हैं या नहीं हो पा रहे हैं 2012 तक के, और अगर वो हो पा रहे हैं दैट मीन्स माई नोट्स आर गुड इनफ, और अगर वो नहीं हो पा रहे हैं तो फिर और किसी के भी नहीं हो पा रहे होंगे. सो आई मूव्ड अहेड with that mindset. So essentially this is how paper 1 is different from paper 2. Let's move ahead to, so we've seen the syllabus as well. We've seen paper 1 and paper 2 in this regard. You can see यहाँ पर जैसे all of this is IPC. So from 1 to 13, it's all IPC. And then you have Prevention of Corruption Act, which is a remote subject. Plea bargaining, which comes under the Criminal Procedure Code, now the BNSS. And Protection of Civil Rights Act 1955 and subsequent legislative developments. So UPSC itself leaves scope for quite a bit of room where they can sometimes you can assume they'll ask you the SC/ST Act. So that's one. With respect to law of torts, so torts happens to be one of my favorite subjects within paper 2, and that's because it was very interesting when you would read it in your first year of law school. तो वापस पढ़ने को मिलता है, आप क्लैट के लिए भी अगर आपने पढ़ा है तो you would have read this. So it's easy to remember. This is one part of paper 2 where case laws are extremely important. There are no sections, as you are aware, it's an uncodified legislation. It's an uncodified law. So there are obviously no sections, which means it's all case laws. So remember the case laws. Some of them are obviously very Bolt versus Stone, etc. Carbolic, sorry, not carbolic, but like Bolt versus Stone and things of that nature. जो case laws सबको आते हैं, it's very landmark. You would find them on malicious prosecution, false imprisonment. You can predict. In fact, at some point, you can predict कि इस साल इनमें से कौन से questions आएंगे based on the previous year records. Like I'm not saying कि आप ये predict करो. I'm saying कि there are patterns that you might be able to recognize, and if you're able to recognize them, you can follow them in that respect. Of course, there's the Consumer Protection Act as well. Now, UPSC has mentioned it as 1986, but in your answers, you should assume that it's either both 1986 and 2019. And I'm pretty sure कि एक दो सालों में ये लोग 2019 लिख के ही UPSC पूछने लगेगी. So that is one. One more thing is, I think कि अगर आप IPC वाले questions answer कर रहे हो, यहाँ पे UPSC does not really mention whether it's the IPC. Also, until this year, they haven't really asked whether it is the IPC or the BNS that they're asking. But because it's been 2 years since the legislations have been notified, I would recommend that you start your answers with BNS. So BNS are the new legislation, so have BNS then. Now the tougher part, which I found quite tougher, because torts to ho jata hai. The tougher part is mercantile law because it's really vast. See, you have contracts here. You have the Partnership Act here, you have the Limited Liability Partnership Act here, you have the Sale of Goods Act, you have the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, and you have the Negotiable Instruments Act. And all of these are technical. अगर मैं आपको ड्रॉइंग ऑफ चेक के बारे में बोल दूंगा, एंडोर्समेंट्स के बारे में बोल दूंगा, और आप NI एक्ट नहीं पढ़ पाए हो, तो आप उसको आंसर कर ही नहीं सकते हो. एंड दैट वाज माय पोजीशन इन द 2023 अटेम्प्ट वेयर आई कुड नॉट स्टडी द NI एक्ट. सो दैट्स व्हाई ऑल ऑफ दीज आर रियली इंपॉर्टेंट इन दैट रिस्पेक्ट. Contracts Act is in itself quite a heavy subject. In my university, so we had Contracts 1 and Contracts 2. So one full year you would study Contracts Act. और यहाँ पे there are so many mercantile laws. And it's not necessary कि Contract Act है तो वही 20 मार्कर होगा. UPSC LLP को भी 20 मार्कर पूछ सकती है. With respect to LLP, one thing that you can do is study the statement of objects and reasons of the LLP Act. Like that will give you an idea about why it was brought in. And even if you don't know the specifics of that answer, through the statement of objects and reasons, you'll be able to answer that. With Indian Partnership Act, of course, there's cocks and kings. But these days, UPSC is asking quite technical questions also within the Indian Partnership Act, especially with respect to dissolution of partnerships. So prepare that as well. Arbitration Conciliation Act, इसके amendments के साथ साथ वो लोग पूछते हैं. So be updated with all the recent developments. I think the last amendment has recently been notified for the A&C Act. तो उसको पढ़ लेना. NI Act, again, predictable questions from the NI Act, but you won't be able to answer them if you've not studied them. And with respect to standard forms of contracts, right, like SFCs. So this is a part where you can actually include current affairs. Otherwise, paper 2 में आप देख रहे हो quasi contracts or breach of contract में there's not really a scope for current affairs. But in SFCs, you have scope for current affairs. You can mention some things like अगर आप KFC जाते हो तो वहाँ पे SFC मिल रहा है, or if you are signing up in a company, you get an SFC. If you make a payment at Domino's, you get an SFC. So you can make it a little bit more interesting. Nothing very substantial here. With respect to Contract Act, also yes, case laws. So in Contract Act, the number of case laws are less, but wherever they are there, they are unmissable. तो मुश्किल से 10-20 केस लॉज होंगे कॉन्ट्रैक्ट में, बट अगर आपने वो मेंशन नहीं किया, अगर आपने जनरल ऑफर में कार्बोलिक वर्सेस स्मोक बॉल कंपनी मेंशन नहीं किया, तो यू आर नॉट गोइंग टू गेट मार्क्स बिकॉज you have to assume 95% of the janta is going to know that. So you have to know that. So in that aspect, number of case laws is lesser, but their importance accordingly becomes a lot higher. It's the same as international law, but वहाँ पे नहीं भी लिखोगे तो भी शायद थोड़े मार्क्स मिल जाए. कॉन्ट्रैक्ट में अगर आपने मेन केस लॉ मिस कर दिया तो नहीं मिलेंगे. जैसे फॉर एग्जाम्पल damages में there's Hadley versus Baxendale, right? Now that, why is that case law important? Is it because it's a case law? No. It's because that case law, if I remember correctly, preceded the development of the Indian Contract Act. So that case law is the reason that we have the act now, and the principles of the case law are, or in report limits जहाँ पे वो reasonable forcibility की बात की गई थी. So these case laws have led to the development of the Contract Act. So their understanding and in some ways their facts, even if you don't have to reproduce them, are really important to make sure that you are able to show the examiner that you're a well-read person जिसने सिर्फ bare act उठा के वो आगे नहीं आया. So that's with respect to that. With LLP, I said you can study the statement of objects and reasons. Now I'll come to one of the most misunderstood parts of the law paper, which is the contemporary legal developments. See, now with respect to CLD, people think there's a lack of dearth of market. So I want to dispel that myth. See, the moment you clear prelims, the good thing about the UPSC industry is that a lot of coachings will release free material for CLD, and all you have to do is enroll and they'll give you free material. So CLD का material आपको थोड़ा बहुत market में ठीक ठाक मिल जाता है. So one, that problem is sorted out. But secondly, what I would do is for current affairs, क्योंकि बाकी तो paper 2 में current affairs का कहीं पे scope इतना है नहीं, so what I would do is that I would consistently read the newspapers, and if there was any development which I felt was notable, I would mention it in my notes. And then when I was studying those notes later on at the time of mains, I would try and see अगर वो notes में कहीं पे CLD fit हो पाए. So for example, if I'm not wrong, if a question would come on Competition Commission of India, and Competition Commission is a part of CLD, so if a question would be there on Competition Act, I would somehow be able to kahin na kahin se fit in whatever I read about Competition Act, just to show that even if I don't know anything, Competition Act is an evolving sort of a nature of an act. So that's something I would do. One more thing is, a lot of people ask कि हम paper 2 में part A को करें या part B को करें. The ideal तरीका is that if you are, because CLD is a part of part B, so the ideal way to do it is that if you're aware, then you should do part A. But अगर आपको नहीं आता है and you haven't been able to prepare well, then you should do part B. Because if there's one part throughout the entire paper 2 where you can write something without knowing anything, that is contemporary legal developments. Because even if you don't know anything, you can write about trial by media. Even if you don't know anything, आप RTI के बारे में थोड़ा लिख सकते हो. आपको एनवायरमेंटल लॉ के बारे में कुछ नहीं आता, आपको MC मेहता आता होगा, आपको गोदावरमन थिरुमलपड़ वाला केस थोड़ा बहुत पता होगा. Same with IT law. If you don't know anything, you would know Shreya Singhal. So that's why this is one part you can do. I'm not saying this is a good answer. All I'm saying is that if you don't know it, this is where you can rely on to make sure कि आप थोड़े बहुत marks secure कर लो. So that is with respect to current affairs in law, as well as so that is with CLD. One part that I wanted to cover was current affairs in law. So As you can see, I, other than CLD, जहाँ पे material आपको coachings दे देती हैं, what I would do is I would sometimes, scroll live law. So that was something I did. Could not integrate much of it, but if there was something landmark, I would certainly know that developments have happened in this sphere. That's really important, that you know that some developments are happening in some sphere. Secondly, with respect to international law, जैसे wars वगैरह चल रही हैं, तो आपको न्यूज़ में आता रहेगा. जैसे अभी न्यूक्लियराइजेशन के ऊपर मैं बोल रहा हूँ, ईरान वॉर इज गोइंग ऑन एज आई एम स्पीकिंग टुडे. So you'll consistently hear news about acts of war, whether a state can declare war, UN Charter, denuclearization. So if you find something really unique in the newspapers, you can mention that somewhere as well. And thirdly, and really importantly, you should not be chasing current affairs for your legal preparation. अगर आपका पहला attempt है, दूसरा attempt है, it's easy to score. Okay, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's possible to score really well in law optional, even if you don't do much of current affairs. Because the syllabus is so vast, not many people are able to just cover it properly. और cover कर भी लेते तो इतने अच्छे से recall नहीं कर पाते. So if you're able to just do static well, chasing current will give you brownie points. But don't go out there chasing brownie points first without covering your static, thinking you'll write the perfect answer. In law optional, just writing decent answers across all would give you the above average marks. So that's about it with respect to current affairs. I also wanted to go ahead with answering the question. I think this is a very misunderstood part. So I've taken out paper 1 for law optional this year. This is 2025 paper. So this is the paper that I wrote and by God's grace cleared. So if you look at this, I want to take just a sample question and see how you would approach this. So for example, if you look at this, it is often said that the decision of Supreme Court in L. Chandra Kumar, this is the question I was discussing. This is question 2, so it's a compulsory question. I don't know if you know, but like first to fifth question and 5A to 5E are all compulsory, and then you have to choose 2 in one section and 1 in another section. You'll get to know this if you see the instructions right at the first page. यहाँ लिखे होते हैं. This is the instructions there. You can read it by pausing it. So anyway, so the question is, it is often said that the decision of the Supreme Court. So what's important here is, yes, it is often said, this is I'll circle, that the decision of the Supreme Court in L. Chandra Kumar, Supreme Court in L. Chandra Kumar, has defeated the very reason of establishing administrative tribunals in India. So the UPSC here is not asking you to summarize the principles of L. Chandra Kumar. The commission here is asking you, it is often said, so they're not even saying कि ये है, ये सच है. ये बोला जाता है कि L. Chandra Kumar के decision ने defeated the reason of establishing administrative tribunals in India. Now, if you start this answer without discussing the reason of establishing administrative tribunals in India, you miss out on something. Because if I were to approach this answer, what I would do is I would first discuss the reason of establishing administrative tribunals in India. Then I would discuss what the L. Chandra Kumar decision said. And then I would discuss how that decision may or may not defeat. So you could have a table, or you could, discuss whether whatever is your opinion, whether that decision defeats or does not defeat the purpose of L. Chandra Kumar. And here also, आपको लॉ कमीशन के रिपोर्ट्स को डालना पड़ेगा. इनफैक्ट द लॉ कमीशन हैज ऑलमोस्ट रिक्वेस्टेड द सुप्रीम कोर्ट कि प्लीज आप एल चंद्र कुमार को रिकंसिडर करो. इट्स गॉन डाउन टू दैट एक्सटेंट. सो if you know all of these facts and you answer them in that series, that's when you write a better answer. Another approach could simply be that you mention Supreme Court in L. Chandra Kumar said that there cannot be a blanket ban on appeals, and therefore 226 and 32 are also allowed under administrative tribunals for appeals against administrative tribunals. But if you mention that, you don't analyze what the commission is asking you to analyze. So that's one. So this question is an easier question. If Article 21 confers on the person the right to live a dignified life, does it also include a right not to live? Examine the constitutional provisions with the help of decided case laws. It's essentially a case law on not only passive euthanasia, and now the moment I say it, I recall that 1 week ago the Supreme Court has granted somebody a permission for passive euthanasia. So that's a current affairs you can integrate. अगर आपको उस बंदे का नाम पता है, case law पता है, so that becomes a good answer. So here you have to mention if Article 21 confers on person the right to live a dignified life. अब आप यहाँ पे ये लिख दो कि Article 21 confers on person the right to live a dignified life as held in the case of so and so. Does it also include a right not to live? इसके बारे में सुप्रीम कोर्ट की बहुत सारी जजमेंट्स हैं. Examine the constitutional provisions. So you must mention the article here. अगर आपने यहाँ article नहीं लिखा तो you do a very big sin with the help of decided case laws. I also want to take at one international law question, but yeah, so look at this, right? Examine the provisions under the Indian Constitution that authorize the Parliament to legislate on the subject matters of the state list of the 7th schedule. So this is typically a very difficult question because it's not just asking you to discuss Article 246 and 254 and the 7th schedule. It's essentially asking you to examine the provisions under the Indian Constitution that authorize the Parliament to legislate on subjects on state list. And if you recall correctly, if you'll think about it, it's not just 246, it's not just the 7th schedule, it's actually the schedule जहाँ पर extraordinary provisions जहाँ articles दिए हुए हैं, जहाँ पे extraordinary provisions के अंदर the parliament can be authorized, जैसे कि water act को legislate किया था when multiple states passed a resolution or the Rajya Sabha passes a resolution. So it's actually asking about that, and it doesn't want just the mention, it wants you to examine those provisions. So that's how it's like, it's not as easy as it sounds. What I mean to say is that there was a time when in law optional, if you just knew the provisions, you would be able to answer. But now they're even moving towards something a little bit more analytical, requires a little bit of more thinking. So that knowledge needs to be combined. So that essentially brings me to the close of what I wanted to discuss. Of course, if you have any questions, you can come down in the comments. But what I essentially want to say is that it's one, a doable optional. Secondly, yes, the syllabus is very vast. It takes quite a bit of time to cover. But once you cover it, you are not under the constant stress of reading the newspapers every day to just get current affairs for law. And thirdly, I would say one benefit that I skipped mentioning in the beginning, and that will be a reward if you watched it until the end, is that it will really aid your preparation in GS2 as well as the prelims as far as polity is concerned. क्योंकि जब आप directly constitution से पढ़ते हो, your understanding of polity is a lot more different than somebody who's reading just, let's say, M. Lakshmikant sir ki book. So which is why it's a option that if you take, the only con that I see is that it's not very high scoring. So if you don't score well in other subjects, it's difficult to get a top 70 rank. But if you're starting to prepare, you should not think about these things. What you should know is that people have done it before you. People have scored exceptionally well in law. People have gotten selected within the administrative services with a top 50 rank with law every year, almost every year. So that's why it's something that you can study. And I wish you all the best. I look forward to seeing your questions or your comments right below in the comment section. Thank you so much.